Yeah, welcome to the ICE group.
Hi. So let's just jump right into the ICE project. Next slide, please. So, preserving glaciers and keeping the planet cool. Glaciers are actually a major climate change or a keeper of climate, so to say, as in they have a very, very, very bright surface, which reflects a lot of light, and they are very, very cold, both of which are factors to keep the environment in which they are placed very, very cold. But as of lately, both with the trend of global warming and also other local climate changes, there's begun to be in this positive feedback loop between a lot of glaciers. Namely in the fact that they are very, very bright. And as they melt, a lot of water or dark area around them is exposed, which leads to more heat absorption from the sunlight, which heats up the environment, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide.
Yes. So our place for field work at point 660 is some distance from Kangerlussuaq, our town. The trip from the town to ICET is 35 kilometers, and it takes about one and a half hour to go there. And we are 11 students in all, yeah, in two groups and doing the research. Next slide, yes.
So within this project, we were all concerned with the same idea. So understanding the factors that could lead to increased melt rate and kind of like coming up with ideas for how we might combat that effect and preserve glacial ice. So to pursue this one idea, we split into 3 separate groups to take different approaches. So the field group, which was in Kanger, was studying how the thickness of sediments on cames could affect the melt rate of the ice underneath. Then there was the remote lab group, which used ice cubes and sediments and soil to kind of model how the different factors of sediment cover could affect melt rate. And then you had the third team, which was also in Kanger, and then also had a remote student, the engineering team. And they kind of built on the work of the previous 2 groups to kind of study how we might be able to come up with practical real world solutions for slowing down the melting of glaciers. Next slide.
All right, the lab team. So the lab team looked at how the sediment on top of the ice affects the ice's melting rate. We chose 3 characteristics that could be tested with the resources available to us. Specifically, we looked at the thickness of the layer of sediment, the size of the particles that make up the sediment, and the proportion of the surface of the ice that is covered by the sediment. Conducting these tests allowed us to isolate the variables in play on the glaciers and determine what role each one has in contributing to the total melting of the ice. Next slide, please. Here you can see our 3 setups spread across the country. Next slide. All right, so in this experiment, I looked at what influence the size of the sediment has on the ice's melting rate. I concluded that the smaller the particles in the sediment, the faster the ice melted. This, I hypothesize, is due to the density of the sediment, with smaller particles packing closer together. This reduces the amount of insulating air within the sediment and allows the heat to transfer faster to the ice. As you can see in this graph, with the yellow line being the small sediments, it melted the quickest of all of them, with big sediments coming in second. In the case of the fine sediment or soil, there is only a slight decrease in melt rate from the control with no coverage. And this could be due to the amount of air trapped in the soft, fine soil. Now, ideally, in the future with these experiments, they would be done with sediment of the same composition, the only difference being the size of the particles in each, as opposed to having 2 with rocks, 1 with soil. And it would also be done with more trials and more steps between the sediment sizes to get a better picture of the whole scene. Next slide, please.
For my part of the lab experiment, I analyzed how the percentage of ice covered impacts the melting rate. I conducted 5 different trials, each adding on another quarter of coverage per trial. I used black paper to make each quarter very defined. The black paper simulates the effect sediment would have. As you can see from the graph, the blue line representing no coverage has a lower melting point than the orange full coverage line. Another interesting thing to see was that every time another quarter of coverage was added, the melting rate increased. This was an interesting relationship I saw in the data. In all, the overall results point to a higher percentage of coverage does in fact increase the melting rate.
So in my experimental trials, I was looking at how increasing the depth of the soil layer would change the melt rate of the ice beneath. So as you can see from my data, the 2 tablespoons of soil, which was the thickest soil, was definitely the one that had the fastest melt rate in the beginning. And then the one with 1 tablespoon and the control were both sort of in the middle, and then they all kind of leveled off at the end. So in theory, a good explanation for this would just be the albedo effect. So if you have this super reflective surface, which is just the control, which is just ice, and then you add on layers of soil, which are darker, those are going to absorb more heat, and so the ice will melt faster. And that definitely makes sense. But we also kind of think that since the 2 tablespoons, so the thickest layer, was melting at a rate that was so much greater than the 1 tablespoon, we also kind of think there was another factor involved, which was the conduction just from the soil itself. So I had left the soil and the sediments in a pot in the shade, so they weren't excessively hot. But the thing is that they were still, quite a bit warmer than the ice that had come right out of the freezer. So we think that whatever effects we would have seen from the albedo, just having a darker surface, was also kind of conflated with the extra variable of just having the conduction from the soil that was just warmer than the ice. So if we were able to kind of continue this and do this on a broader scale with more trials and different varying thicknesses, what we hypothesized we would eventually see is that we would reach a point where you would kind of get an insulation effect coming into play, where you would kind of have this increasing melt rate as you increase thickness because of the albedo, but then you'd reach a point where it's sort of insulating the ice, and so you'd kind of reach a peak and then go back down as that comes into effect. So if we were able to do more trials and kind of have a bigger setup, that's something that we would definitely have liked to explore and kind of get a better idea of the interplay between albedo and insulation. And those are both ideas that you're going to be hearing a lot about when we go to our 2 teams in Greenland. So speaking of them, can we go to the next slide? So the lab team discovered that the sediment thickness, size, and percentage of coverage all did affect the melt rate. So how does that translate to our groups in Greenland? Next slide, please.
Okay, so in our project, we wondered or researched the difference in sediment thickness of the cames at 0.660. And in the video you are seeing, we are standing on the edge of the ice at 0.660, you can see the cames, which Erica is pointing at, and they are these cone-shaped brown things, which is created by the melt from the ice sheet, they are covered by sediment or dirt, and this sediment has an insulating effect, and therefore the ice under is not melted, and this is what we are interested in. So next slide. And therefore our question was, what role does the sediment play in the creation or preservation of the cane?
So how did we do it? We measured height of the dirt sediment, thickness of dirt sediment, orientation north, south, east, and west, size of the cames, experiment before and after pictures. Next.
Next slide. Yeah, analysis and findings. This is the picture of the where we are working in the field. As you can see, the round ones are the cames. Yeah, next.
So when we were near the cames, we measured, we took samples from them. We took sediments from each of the 4 orientations, and it was a 10 by 10 centimeter, so we could compare the data. And then we summed it all up, and this is a diagram showing the results. So as you can see, the southern facing side has twice as much sediment placed on it as the northern side, which is quite interesting. Next slide, please. Also, we can see that the thickness of the sediment is actually greatest on the southern side of the came. Next slide, please. And this can be explained maybe by our qualitative experiment where we took before and after pictures of this came. So if you could press, Erica, yeah. So on the came, we removed a lot of the sediment on some of the came. And then when we came back 24 hours later, a lot of it was melted away. And then we could see that all of the sediment that had been placed on the northern side actually moved to the southern side. So yeah, next slide.
Yeah, we also found that the average thickness of the sediment was between 1 to 2 centimeters regardless of the size of the cames. And so we believe that this is the sweet spot where the sediment actually becomes insulating and starts protecting the ice and helps it not melt. Next.
So the conclusion, and sediment reduces melt rate. The sediment is cames tended to have a thickness between 1 to 2 centimeter. We believe sediment is needed to preserve the ice underneath. We also found that the southern face of the came had a tendency to have a thicker sediment. To conclude exactly how sediment can affect the preservation of cames. Further research is needed. Next slide. So I've been drawing and painting JSEP2020 ice field team. Next slide.
So now the engineers come in, going on to protect the glaciers. So how can we preserve these melting glaciers? Is there anything we can do to prevent them melting? Next slide, please. So as engineers, what we do is we look at different properties of materials to determine what would be best. In this case, we had a couple of hypotheses. Hypothesis number 1 would be that materials with high albedo, at least theoretically, should reflect a whole lot more light and therefore keep the heating from the sun from becoming a problem on the glacier itself. Another one was that materials from nature could be the solution, since nature usually finds a solution before we do, and it's usually a lot more efficient. Another last thing we decided to try was to see if we could find something cheap and accessible. So we also brought a simple sheet of plastic out on the ice. Don't worry, we retrieved it to see what difference that would do. Next slide, please.
Yep, so we got out there and set up our project. We prepared 5 different materials to work as covers. You can see them on the pictures to the right. We got a plastic bag, black plastic bag, sealskin, just a simple white towel, aluminum foil, and about 3 centimeter layer of gravel, which we also found on the ice. Then we placed our covers on the ice and came back the next day. We measured how much the ice has melted underneath our covers, and then we also measured the albedo of our covers. Next slide. From the results, we can say that aluminum provided the best protection because, as you can see on the graph, no snow has melted underneath the aluminum. We can explain that by 2 things. First of all, Aluminium had one of the highest albedo factors in all of our 5 covers. And second of all, we accidentally trapped a air bubble in between the 2 layers of aluminium foil, which provided better isolation. If you keep looking at the graph, you'll see how much ice has melted onto the different covers. There's names underneath, and the red line will be symbolizing how much ice without covers melts on average, which is about 4.4 centimeters. While measuring our albedo, we stumble upon a funny thing, which is that there is a very thin connection between the albedo of the material and how much it protects the ice, which means if a certain material, for example, a towel, has a very high albedo or reflective capability, it will not necessarily mean that it will preserve the ice best. A plastic bag was a very good example of that, as it had the lowest albedo, yet did one of the best jobs. Next slide.
So what we can basically conclude from this is that both air, or insulation factor, as we call it, and the albedo has a major role to play in reducing ice melt. There was no direct correlation from our data that actually suggested that albedo was a main factor, but what we definitely could do was to work further towards researching the difference in albedo with more non-isolating factors and just different albedos, or we could work more with the insulating properties of different materials by taking different materials with the same albedo, but with different amount of insulation. Next slide, please. This was a lovely experiment done by Wallace. So I would like to thank her for that, but I'm afraid I can't explain a lot of this. So next slide, please. So essentially what we've drawn from all of these 3 experiments is, number 1, preserving glaciers is really important. They have a major role to play both in the global and local climates. And what we can take away from these different experiments is we know a lot more about the properties of ice and sediment on top and general melt rates. And we know that it's possible to cover these glaciers and reduce ice melt from different projects that have been done in the Alps, namely in Austria and Italy. However, those were only to partially prevent melt. And also beyond our great research that we've done, we also found out that we need a whole lot more before we can draw any serious conclusions and come up with some evidence that would be good enough to at least legitimize ourselves. But that is all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So maybe Natalie can unmute everyone briefly so we can give a round of applause, or you can unmute yourselves.
Awesome.
Excellent, thank you so much. And I think that we have maybe about time for like 1 question. So if anybody has a question for the ICE group, they can put it into the chat. And in the meantime, Erica is going to queue up the next presentation, which is going to be by the Food Sustainability Group. There's a question from Maddie in the chat. I want to know, how did you measure how much ice melted under the objects you put on the ice?
I think this is for our group, right? For the lab group.
It was actually for the well, I guess you guys could answer it too, but I was curious also about the
for the field group.
The field group who was measuring things on the glacier.
Right. Yeah, why don't I let them take that one, because I think that's the more interesting answer.
So essentially what we did was that we drilled a hole, measured the depth before and after we had placed it. So we that sounds dumb. The day before and the day after. We drilled a hole underneath the cover, put the cover on, well, drilled a hole, measured the depth, put the cover on, left for a day, came back, took the cover off, and measured the depth. We did, however, also, just to make sure, drilled holes besides each one, so we had a reference point, which is the one we've drawn the average from on the graph. But yeah, that's how we measured it. Of course, there will be uncertainties in that, but that was the most reliable way we could think of.
Great, thank you so much. So thank you so much again to the ICE team.